Well, welcome today to a lecture by Professor Peter Fonagy on trust and interdependence during Covid-19, lessons from the study of human attachment. And I don't think we could have a better person than Peter to deliver this lecture. He's an international leader in the study of attachment and has made numerous contributions, some of which he'll refer to during the course of his lecture, which have not only helped people with a range of mental health problems, but I think have some important lessons that we can learn from about how, as a country, as an individuals, we cope with the demands of the current pandemic.
Thank you, Steve, and it's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be here, and I hope that I will be able to live up to that marvelous introduction. As a colleague, Steve and I have been working together many years. He never introduced me this generously to anybody, so I'm grateful for the occasion, let alone anything else. Let me perhaps go and share my slides as best I can. It's always anxious times. I'm not very sure that I can actually get the thing done, but I hope that you can see my slides at the moment. And before starting, I want to say that slides are available, and the email there, if you could scribble it down, I can't also at the end. I'm happily send you the slides and share them with you. Before, again, starting on the talk, I want to acknowledge the people who actually worked on this with me and actually did most of the work for me. Liz Allison in particular, a wonderful person from the Psychoanalysis unit at UCL. She directs the Psychoanalysis unit, but also somebody else in that unit, and that's Dr. Chloe Campbell. And the other people on the screen are people who have been working along with us for many years. So I'm going to be talking about connectedness and isolation, and I'm going to talk about some key propositions about attachment theory, talk a little bit about loneliness, talk about mentalizing. Then I'll be a little bit self-critical about the kind of limitations that our approach had in the past. And then sweeping it all aside, I'm going to talk about the role of connectedness and the role of epistemic trust and transgenerational transmission, which actually brings me then to the risk of isolation for children. And that is obviously what, because of the pandemic, we are all facing, and how there is a risk because of that isolation that some of the normal mechanisms that are available to support children are no longer there, and adversity can turn into trauma. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But before starting on the more COVID-related things, let me just give you a few ideas that, for those of you that are not familiar with attachment theory, talk a bit about the nature of human attachment. And obviously the guy whose name is associated with this is John Bowlby, and he has written, not with us, but he has written extensively on the biological function of creating links between infants and caregivers that protect, create a safe haven, protect the infant, and this following from that creates a kind of universal bonding between the caregiver and the child. The process is triggered by anxiety, and it's a biobehavioral system that ensures safety and reciprocity, and in the sense of the caregiver offering security at the same time as being there for the child, and I will say a great deal more about that as we go along. But it basically is a very simple system. The child is exposed to threat that generates distress and fear that activates this biological system, that biobehavioral system that John Bowlby described, that leads to a behavioral reaction in infants of proximity seeking, which in turn helps downregulate the child's emotion. Caregiver serves to downregulate the child's emotion, and that creates a bond to the caregiver that is there for life. It's there for life, and the system is there for life, and it governs also our romantic relationships as adults, has the same sequence as the child-caregiver relationship has, that the child is open, could be attached to anybody, it's non-exclusive, but then falls in love with the caregiver as we fall in love in adulthood, and that becomes a safe haven, a secure base, and we seek from our attachment figures security throughout our lives. And the involuntary separation from that attachment figure creates the same sequence of feelings that we all observe in infants. That's protest, that's despair, that's kind of reorganization, and then detachment. And that's what we see on separation. When infants experience prolonged separation, and also if romantic relationships break down. So much about attachment, but I now want to talk about connectedness and rather the lack of it, the perils of isolation for humankind, because it turns out that social connection is required for self-coherence, and social isolation actually kills. The reason for this biologically is fairly simple. Human babies are born dependent on a caregiver, dependent on being looked after for longer than any other primate. Birth itself is extremely dangerous, painful, and requires help from kin around. Early in our evolution, and for 99% of our evolution, we were hunters, gatherers, and we walked in groups of about 150 individuals who had a reciprocal relationship. Everybody protected the young. There was 24/7 care. The children roamed freely, and we played with anybody. And no hunter-gatherer ever walks alone. Wind forward a few millennia, and what you find is that actually living alone is now quite common, and it's associated with loneliness. So the prevalence of feeling lonely in the population is about 10%. 10% of us feel lonely. But in fact, some of us feel lonely even when we are living with a partner, although that, of course, substantially mitigates it. Is this important? It is important because loneliness actually almost doubles the risk of depression, 20% more anxiety, and 30% more suicidal ideation. So it's actually dangerous to our mental health. It's also dangerous to our physical health. Socialization, the odds ratio of increased mortality at 1.29, so 29% more likely to die. And that's loneliness or living alone have more or less the same impact. No difference between objective or subjective loneliness. I think a further important point is that this under 65 is really a primary driver of premature death. This is a frightening chart for some of us. This is adjusted mortality of 4 groups. These are accumulated numbers. You can only die once. But looking at it cumulatively, what you see there is that you're a single father, you'll die you're far more likely to die over a 15-year period than if you are a partnered father. But look at the single mothers and partnered mothers. Actually, women die less in any case, but for the single or partner, they seem to survive a lot more. So being a partnered father, I am slightly more at risk. But what I want to talk about in relation to this is not death. I want to talk about something that is, I think, unique about humans, because isolation affects other primates, other animals equally badly. But we have something that is unique to our species, which is we are poised to interact with others. We have a capacity to meet others' minds, to assume a task, to be joined, just jointly seeing to it. And that kind of joint collaboration has selected us as a species from other primates because we are able to be part of thoughts and feelings that are in a part of a community. It's an irreducible collective mode of cognition, something that we call the we mode. And what drives it is something that I'd like to now focus on. And the concept that we have been working on for about since the early 1990s, the concept of mentalizing. And it drives that we mode, that drives collaboration. That's imagining mental activity in others, but also in ourselves in relation to our behaviors. That when we see somebody act in a particular way, we interpret that in terms of the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, goals, purposes, reasons that they might have for that action. And that capacity actually starts very early on. It is born, we believe, in the attachment relationship. The caregiver's mirroring of the infant's mental state before the infant has a capacity to mentalize actually creates in the infant the propensity, the likelihood that they will see themselves as thinking, feeling, believing, desiring individuals. It creates the space for seeing oneself as being driven by mental states, by mentalizing. Mentalizing actually has become very popular. This is, I love showing these slides. It shows how the concept of mentalizing has taken off between 1976, and we only started working in 1989. And you can see that it is now, in terms of the articles published citing the concept, has become a very popular concept. But actually, if you look at Google's Ngram Viewer, you recognize that although it has become more popular since 1990s, there was also a period in the 1880s when it was a very popular concept. And we looked into why this might be the case. It comes from, obviously, neuroscience. And this is an illustrative quote. Hammond, writing in 1880, has conducted a series of careful urinal analysis for the purpose of ascertaining the changes in the composition of the urine incident to increased mentalization. From these experiments, he's led to draw the following conclusions: that increased mental exertion augments the quantity of urine. I don't think we would measure mentalizing now in that way, but it gives you an idea that the idea has been around for some time. This is a more recent test of mentalizing. If you look at this picture, is that a friendly, sad, surprised, worried expression? I think most of you see it as friendly. This is Simon Baron-Cohen's measuring mentalizing by reading the mind in the eyes. This is a more difficult one. Is that surprised, sure about something, joking, or happy? Well, it's sure about something. I hope that you'll recognize that. And this more difficult again, joking, flustered, desire, and convinced. And the answer is desire. This is the only one that we have a gender difference on. Women immediately get it. Men look at it and say, is that joking? What is it? Anyway, moving rapidly on. In the early 1990s, we came up with a finding that actually was at the time quite novel, that a mother's capacity to mentalize herself and her past, as well as her child, actually increased the likelihood that that child would be securely attached. And that has been confirmed through many, many studies, looking at this whole range of ways of measuring parental mentalizing in relation to an infant. There are indeed at least 4 ways of doing that. The physical sensitivity of the caregiver, the extent to which the caregiver uses mental state words, the extent inside the caregiver shows the child, and something that we call reflective function, the capacity of the parent to reflect on the motivation of the child or indeed on themselves. And the finding on this in relation to attachment are now very clear. It does predict attachment security, does sensitivity predict attachment security, and in fact, parental sensitivity is largely mediated by that. The point I would like to make here is that early adversity, social adversity, which is really the absence of sensitivity, may be also mediated by impaired mentalizing capacity, leading to persistent distress in the adult. And I don't want to talk about that at the moment in great detail. It's another talk. But these are long-term mental health conditions that individuals that are rooted in childhood and infancy. In mediation analysis, as I said, parental mentalizing is enormously important in negotiating the relationship between the wish to be sensitive to your child and the capacity of the child to respond to you in a way that indicates that they have found a secure base, that they are bonded to you in a robust way. The absence of that robustness that is sometimes indicated by a disorganization of the attachment system is, as I mentioned, associated with personal experience in the caregiver of adversity. However, if the caregiver is able to mentalize that experience, think about that experience, process that experience of adversity, is far less likely that she will pass on her experience to the child, and that relationship to the child will be one of disorganized attachment. I think I can answer questions about that, but I would really rapidly like to move on to try and talk about some of the problems that we face that is very relevant to the COVID situation. The challenges that our theory, as it was originally stated, faces is really that not just what psychoanalysts have raised in relation to being mechanistic and reductionistic and other problems, but what anthropologists have pointed out, that it seems somewhat culturally blind and it's socially oblivious, and it misses different family configurations. And empirically, it's based on weird people, where weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this is a major, major problem, because who is our knowledge in psychology based on? It's based on the weird world, which is just 12% of the global population. What about the 88% who are not in this Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic world? Well, when you look at it, what you find is that 96% of participants in psychological studies are from the weird community. That's what our knowledge of people is based on. So actually, you're more likely, as an American undergraduate, 4,000 times more likely to be a research participant than anybody from outside the West. Does this matter here? It matters enormously, because in the weird world, we have a very specific idea of sensitive responsiveness that's face-to-face, that is based on this serve and return sensitivity. The infant does something, the caregivers does something in return. So the infant learns about themselves as an independent agent from the caregiver, and then only secondarily learns about others to generalize that understanding of themselves to others. But beyond the weird world, what we see is something quite different. An infant who's turned outward, who's sitting on the caregiver's lap, metaphorically speaking, and is asked to take the perspective of others. Is a kind of apprentice to the caregiver's understanding of others, and only secondarily learns about themselves. So secure attachment to an individual parent in this context makes very little sense. What we should be thinking about is really what vulnerability the parent and infant both experience. We're actually turning outwards. Alertness and vigilance and suspicions is really what is more important. So to emphasize something here, the dyadic turn-taking, the kind of cultural ideal of the infant as an agent that's sensitized to use personal qualities and attributes as the primary referent of actions, and recognizes themselves as being at the center of the universe, creates a specific attitude in the Western world. Whereas this is true, but it may be actually something that is just a specific example of something much broader, something of much greater connectedness. And that connectedness is given by being aware of multiple simultaneous ongoing activities around the child. Those 150 people walking around with us, 99% of our evolution, they are doing things and they are working together collaboratively in order to ensure our survival. It's important that we understand them and are sensitized to their interests and their priorities. And then we use that as a reference to our action. When we recognize ourselves in that context, that we feel that there is a match. So what's the problem here? The problem is that has remained the same in human beings, but it has changed in the sense that our grandparents are no longer around. The nuclear family is the governing structure of social connectedness. And this was actually brought to surface by the social isolation of COVID. But actually, this is a real problem. The de-emphasis of physical contact in schools, for example, is actually, in terms of connectedness, affects children profoundly. And our theories in psychology have been excessively focused on the nuclear family, ignoring the sociocultural context. So we have a view of family as being at the center of everything, and we have ignored the extent to which actually that family is embedded in the community that they are in. And that is the Copernican revolution that I feel is one of the things that the COVID crisis has drawn our attention to strongly. Just how limited how limited the nuclear family context is compared to what children, young people, and also adults need. So what is going on here? What I think this actually relates to is something that is actually primary and a key concern in our evolution and in the way human evolution differs from all other species. And that is the way we pass knowledge on from one generation to another. We have a culture that is created that's not in our genes, but we pass on. But in passing it on, we have to be able to differentiate who we can learn from and who we should be vigilant to learn only some things from and not others, or maybe nothing from. And this is a concept of epistemic trust. And it's really important because it means it signals that we need to trust particular people. We need to learn in that social context of ours from those who can be trusted, who have our interest in mind as opposed to others' interests. And it is, I feel, the openness that epistemic trust creates that enables so much of what protects us from the normal adversity and normal trauma that happens to all of us during our everyday life. How can we know who to trust? Where do attachment and mentalization fit into this? Well, our ancestors who lived in small groups and small social groups tried to live in social networks that was complex and where you didn't know incidentally who you could trust and who was there for you, whose knowledge was relevant to you. And we evolved a very interesting and important system, which is to listen to ostensive cues. This is the concept of philosopher Russell. But in this context, it means being responsive to who is listening to us, who's taking turns with us, who's making eye contact with us. And infants from a very early age notice this. And when they notice this, they will learn from that person. They will take that piece of information that they've just received as something that they should learn, that was part of culture, that they should carry on and use in other situations beyond the ones that they are in. This is a very simple study that illustrates this. There is an infant of 18 months is seeing an orange and the blue object. The experimenter comes in and asks for one. The infant 50% of the time gives one or other, no preference. Then in another condition, the experimenter comes in and says, "Hello, baby, hello, baby, hello, baby," with the experimenter smiles widely. Then smiles at one of the objects, and then frowns at the other one. Then another person comes in. And in this situation, 71% of the infants will pass on the object that was smiled at. So the attitude, the positive attitude, was transmitted from one person to the next. The same experimenter, but no initial smiling, but the same favorable attitude is expressed towards one object and unfavorable to the other one. The other person comes in, and in this situation, only 40% of infants pass on. They gain chance level that pass on the object. But the infant is not stupid, because even when there is no social contact, but the infant is there without social contact, alone, if you like, the same smiling, the same frowning, and in this situation, the same person asks for the object. 77% of the infants pass on the object that was smiled at. That is, the infant notices that that person prefers that object. But the epistemic trust that opens up the mind of the infant to learning about what this culture prefers was lost. So, to summarize in brief, ostensive cues make the infant feel recognized, and that creates epistemic trust and the capacity to listen. Now, when you grow up, when you're an adult, you have a personal narrative. The understanding of that narrative by another human, by another person, creates the potential for a trust. The perception of the understanding generates epistemic trust. As it is a perception, it could be that it's an illusion of understanding rather than genuine understanding. But that's the biological mechanism that we evolved for transmitting culture across generations. So to illustrate this, the learner has a person, an imagined self-narrative, and that is perceived by the instructor, which in turn is then perceived by the learner. And that match between the self-narrative and the learner's image of the instructor's image of the learner's self-narrative is what opens this channel for knowledge transfer between generations. Mentalizing is obviously essential for this process at several points, creating the self-narrative, creating the other person's self-narrative, and also creating the person's self-narrative or the other person's self-narrative, and so on. We did a very simple study to show this. This is just a very simple one to explain. We invited participants to the experiment in 4 conditions. One, they had this ostensive cue of recognition where they were invited by name and they were asked on their arrival where they were born and what they studied. In another condition, it wasn't the experimenter, but the computer asked them their name. And in a third condition, it was both conditions were combined. The experiment was an incidental learning task. Words were presented. The subject, the participant didn't know that they would be asked to recall. There was an unexpected recall task at the end. So they didn't want to learn the thing, but they were, how open was their mind? And what we found is just being called by name, by a computer, or by the experimenter, or especially when you had both, made people recall more words, which actually surprised us as well. Compare that to this email that I received last year, that I was addressed as dear default value. So I think it just shows how important that is. Anyway, so why is this important now for COVID? Because this strategy of making connections, this linking has become massively important because we know that vigilance and openness are not equally valuable to the child. In general, Western culture emphasizes openness, but actually, in the condition of secure attachment, favorable caregiving, that probably is right. But if there is adversity behind, if there is trauma that faces child, actually vigilance is the preferred strategy. What's the average expectable environment? Well, we have a view in our culture that it is something like these pictures illustrate. But in our history, this actually not right. Cross-culturally, but also in terms of Western history, children were required to be quite vigilant because childhood could be a history of unmitigated hardship and adversity. And even now, in shanty towns in Brazil, what you find is that mothers actually, because of the likelihood of infant mortality, actually do not connect to the child and remain a little bit watchful whether the infant will survive or not. There is an emotional estrangement. So things that we regarded as universal are far from so. But if humans adapt to their social environment in order to survive best by trust, This is only the case when the environment is favorable. When the environment is harsh, actually vigilance or even hypervigilance is what the child and young person needs to do. They need to close their mind rather than open them. And in general, probably the default value should be vigilance, not trust. So when we apply this to the community, dichotomizing the community, denying our dependence in times of prosperity, maybe is helpful. That we believe that the nuclear family is all that it needs. But it's less risky to be trusting when you know that there is not much competition. However, what this has led to is a defensive, what I believe, a defensive underestimation of the importance of social context for our health. This is a lovely study that shows that when people are asked to rank the importance of various things for their health, they rank not smoking highest. What you can see there in red is the subjective ranking. What you can see in green is the true rank of importance. What you see is that people rank 9th and 11th social support and social integration, which is the first and second most important thing for our health, as far as we can tell. And that's even more dramatic when you look at the actual risk involved in terms of odds ratios. The dependence on the community is a problem when we approach the community with excessive vigilance. If there is excessive competition, for example, because of hardship in large families, even the caregivers might not be able to provide the kind of ideal background for trustworthiness. The child needs to turn to other adults in the social world to be able to. What that means is that the more adversity there is in a nuclear family, the more the child is dependent on other adults being around. So the importance of this is that our children are going to be more impacted on by the limitations that the Covid-19 has imposed on all our lives when they come from environments of greater adversity within their nuclear family. And this turned out to be the case. Social inequality has magnified its impact. And that's because the mitigation in community that communities provided wasn't there. Why is that? And that's because normal social living addresses adversity by that individual joining that community and that restoring the capacity to mentalize that is enhanced and reinforced by the presence of the social group. But if the child has no one to turn to and they are separated off from trustworthy adults all the way around, they are far more likely to be traumatized. The impact of social isolation is indeed trauma. I think adversity turns into trauma when the mind experiences itself as being alone, when there is no support, social support for building up the capacity to think about the community, think about other people's mental state. Less affluent communities are identified, there will be a greater danger associated with the need for hypervigilance. To finish, the model that I'm suggesting is that the experience of adversity would normally drive for increased motivation for social connectiveness, which would then connect to others, that restores mentalizing. And restored mentalizing then enables us to learn again from others, to have epistemic trust, to enter the we mode, to join the community, to open our minds. And that's is the mitigation of traumatic isolation, which I think is a risk that we are currently facing. Experience of adversity creates epistemic mistrust, which isolates the experience of the individual, making them feel they are unlikely to be supported, and develops hypervigilance that in turn feeds into a sense of reluctance to avoid a sense of alienation, which I think we have to really watch when we watch our children to school after a long absence. But that community, that sense of being there for the community is of great importance, as I hope I've been able to show in terms of education and other contexts. And I'm now trying to stop sharing my slide.
So thank you very much, Peter, for, as I expected, enormously interesting lecture, which really raises for me a series of very significant questions about how we conduct ourselves, not just as a society in COVID, but actually I think some of the problems you identified there have been with us for quite a long time. I was very pleased to see that picture from Let Us Praise Famous Men, James Agee and Walker Evans, which described something about the struggles that people had in, I think, rural Tennessee in the 1930s, depression, and the sense that sometimes where communities came together, people coped much better. So there are a number of questions that people have picked up on. And I might just try and pick up one or two, which is there's a couple. One, for example, from Mary Richardson, saying something, how do we really know who to trust in broader communities in which we reside? We might understand other people's views, but will we trust them? It's a kind of interesting question about that sense of community.
I think it's a wonderful question. And the evolutionary system that we have at our disposal, this business of using ostensive cues, is very easily misled. We are not, people can pretend to understand us, and we fall for that. I don't want to be politically contentious, but there are political messages that are specially directed at particular groups, aiming to pretend to understand their feelings of distress and their sense of having been hard done by, which then create a trust in a person who's unable to use other structures to kind of triangulate that. And there is no really good alternative to actually, other than instinctually responding, we also should respond by computing. It's a harder task. By, why is that person doing what they are doing? And at those times, it may be sometimes to recognize inauthenticity. But inauthenticity is a major problem within this system.
So just following up on that, there's another question about the impact of children being out of school. What the specifics are, what might be the impact of 3 months absence on development. But it might be interesting to hear from Peter a more general view and straying a little bit potentially into politics, but where should we be with schools? What should they be doing? What if the reparation work can be done? I'd be interested in what you have to say.
I mean, I think we are, this is a political issue. I think we have decided to appropriately not to overwhelm the NHS, and we decided to protect individuals over 45 and people like myself who are at great risk of this virus. Children are not at great risk of this virus, fortunately. I think one important thing is that we recognize just how much children need the social environment that schools normally provide, that have to reach outside of the nuclear family and engage with their community in order to actually open their mind to learning. And that is the most important thing they can do. The paradox of it is that if they are feeling avoidant and suspicious, they close their mind. So the very thing that we want schools to be able to achieve by prolonging their social isolation, we actually might have placed them more at risk of this hypervigilance, of a kind of a long-term difficulty with learning that we know happens to children who have experienced trauma, and we know that NSPCC has reported increased, and Childline all reported increased prevalence of distressed young people. So there is a risk, and from my point of view, the sooner we get kids back into schools, the better.
And just encourage other people to send in questions if you have them. But just to follow up on that, I agree with you, Peter. I think schools are central to child health. But the early slides you show clearly indicated that social isolation is bad for all of us, whether you're 5, 15 or 75. Are there prescriptions, and that's not quite the right word, actually, I'll withdraw that, but is there advice that you have for us about what we ought to be doing about our wider community? As you know, I've been doing some work recently on trying to reset the community mental health services in the UK. And one of the aphorisms we had was putting the community back into mental health, because it's really, I think, been rather absent. But anything about how, not just at the school level, but at the wider level, you think we ought to be working with, supporting communities in a way perhaps we're not doing at the present time?
But it's a very good question. What follows from that kind of data is that we should be doing providing social support for individuals when they're in isolation. It turns out that that kind of artificial provision of social support is less effective than you had hoped it would be. The effect sizes are very small. It needs natural human relationships, and they are much, much more difficult to provide without changing our culture and maybe de-emphasizing individual achievement and re-valuing the importance of communal achievement and the importance of belonging. And how we do that is quite hard, because what we teach our children in this weird world is just how important their personal achievements are, and not necessarily how important it is that they work as a group, kind of jointly seeing to it, which really is what our biology is key to.
So the question just come through about the over-reliance of, as you pointed out at the beginning, of psychology on results from the weird world. And just to put you a bit on the spot, I mean, if there was one study that you could do that would really bring some learning from the non-weird world into the weird world, what might it be? Easy question.
An easy question. Well, we did a study of Ethiopian moms from the southern countries in Ethiopia, whose babies were not developing, who needed food supplements because of, although it's not considered by Ethiopia to be there, but malnutrition does exist. What we did, a very simple intervention, we trained unemployed youth in elementary play therapy. So they taught the moms to play with their kids, and the kids grew more rapidly, and they gained weight more rapidly, and what it showed to me was that very simple intervention that are imaginative, that you can bring to a particular social environment, taking advantage of a social environment. And I think probably in our culture, we're not harnessing the capacity of groups to help each other. So in the street where I live, people have created a WhatsApp where we're helping each other in very much the same way, creating communities, breaking down the barriers between houses, which exist in the world out there, is, I think, the biggest lesson.
So just sticking with that one, I suppose you might argue that something, this gets again a little bit political, but the immediate post-war period had a much greater sense of community, I think, and we did rather better economically and probably socially in that time. And so to again push you a little bit here, Peter, if you were, somebody suggested this, that the government ought to, I think it was David King, ought to appoint a COVID czar. And if you were the COVID czar and you had, of course, a broad range, but if you had a social prescription that you could write, what would it be at that level? What would you want us as a community, as a country, as a collection of individuals to be doing that created something of a communal spirit that I think you're implying is lacking? What might it be?
I would have more testing that actually can reassure people that connections with others are safe. If you have regular testing, very regular testing, you can remove the risk of contact. You can further remove the risk of contact by wearing masks. I do think that that 2 meters is not an obstacle here, that you can do ostensive queuing with a mask on at 2 meters. And I would try and not be so drastic in between black and white, between complete social isolation imposed quite late and trying to create as normal as human social interaction as is possible to do. But fortunately, Steve, I'm not. I don't have that problem, and no, I can leave that to you and other people on stage.
Not my problem either. I just coming back. This is a kind of more personal question, Peter, which, given our age, we're allowed to do and to reflect on things a little. If you had to reset your research track now, knowing what you do know, is there something that you think would have been worth pursuing that there was still uncertain about, that could have some positive impact in the area that we're discussing today?
I think I was personally very much caught up in the weird world, and I personally had assumed that what I was seeing around me was universal. And it's only been more recently, and you and I have just been fortunate to receive a major grant to work in the non-weird world in Kenya and Lebanon, to realize that the priority for us to understand ourselves, as you had implied earlier, is to look beyond ourselves. Just like the infant in the serve and return, diet that I was criticizing earlier as being inappropriately assumed to be universal, I have been regarding my own perspective rather selfishly as universal. And things like Black Lives Matters also draws our attention to how difficult it is to actually take other people's perspectives really genuinely seriously, and how easy it is to fool oneself that one is taking something seriously from another perspective when one really genuinely is not.
Right. Okay. Let me just come back onto the screen. So I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions in, because we're coming near the end of time. So if you've got anything else you would like to ask Peter, folks, I think you should just quickly type it in. And just a kind of perhaps a final question from me, Peter, before we'll see if somebody else has got something to come through. And this is a very narrow, I'm assuming we've got a modestly academic audience here. But in terms of the way that we have shaped, reinforced and rewarded academic research, its focus, as you say, on the real world, the easy, accessible, convenient samples of students. If we were to be designing a new postgraduate research program based on what you've just been saying, what would be your priorities for that program?
Well, the priority would be the same as young people's priority tends to be, which is they want to leave this country behind and want to go to other lands and acquire new perspectives. But really, what you are implying, Steve, is our lack of prioritizing individual achievement, whereas you and I both know that as a researcher, you are successful if you have joined productively a group that works together. Jointly seeing to it is the way that we have evolved, I think, remains what is to be encouraged. I think individual achievement is important, but prioritizing that to the exclusion in our educational system, to the exclusion of getting people to work collaboratively. I remember incidentally, in my second year undergraduate lab classes, we worked as a group of 4. In my third year, I had to work on my own. That wasn't no longer a group exercise. I would keep, and it's happening to some degree, but I would keep work collaborative, because what we need to learn is not so much how to do things ourselves, but how to do things better together.
Right, I'd agree. And I've very much enjoyed our collaborations over the years. So no more questions. I just want to wrap up first by thanking you, Peter. It was an interesting and very thought-provoking lecture. And just for those of you who've been listening, I'd also like you to refer to what I thought was a fantastic interview that Peter did with Jim Al-Khalili on the Life Scientific. It was thoughtful, it was amusing, and it was moving. And if you want to know something more about Peter's interests and how he ended up where he is today, it's a half hour, very well spent. So just to finish, to thank you again, Peter, to thank those for putting in their questions. And I hope that all of you who've listened today have learned something and will go away with a few thoughts, perhaps more interesting ones than you arrived with. And so thank you very much. And thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.